The downfall of Numenor is one of the most tragic parts of Tolkien's world. Numenor was a blessed island given as a reward for the Edain's stalwart resistance against Morgoth, yet thousands of years later their descendants would forget the virtues of their ancestors and become tyrants themselves, and eventually even coming to worship the shadow that they had fought so strongly against. In this video, I want to talk about how Numenor's descent into shadow and eventually its fall was predicted by some over 1,000 years before it started to happen. What I will be talking about in this video is something that comes from the story known as Aldarion and Erendis, or the Mariner's Wife. On the surface, it's a story about a failed marriage. Aldarion is the king's heir and already a prolific sailor before he meets Erendis. They fall in love, but there's one major problem. Aldarion loves the sea more, and to make things worse, Erendis hates the sea. Even after they are engaged, and even after they are wed and have a child, Aldarion continues to set off on long voyages, usually away for years at a time. This causes Erendis to grow bitter, the two separate, and Ancalame, their daughter, ends up being raised with a healthy dislike of men. But when you look deeper, there's actually two really important passages in the story, passages that predict why and how Numenor was going to slide into the shadow. These two passages are in the form of monologues. One is by Erendis, Aldarion's estranged wife, and the other is by Tar-Meneldur, Aldarion's father, who also disapproves of his constant sailing to Middle-earth. While Erendis is speaking scornfully about the men of Numenor, Tar-Meneldur is speaking reflectively about the weight of a decision that faces him. But despite the different tone and subjects, they both arrive to the same conclusion. The men of Numenor, if not tempered by wisdom, will sow the seeds of their own destruction. Let's talk about Erendis first. She is speaking to her daughter, the future queen of Numenor, Tar-Ancalame, and she doesn't hold back on the men of Numenor. She effectively calls them children, saying that they believe that Numenor is their playground, for them to be who they want and do what they want without truly caring about anything else, such as women or nature. One of my favourite parts of this quote is when she says that the men of Numenor are always happy, until they become aware that there is other wills in the world that aren't their own, and then they become ruthless. But it's this bit that is most important. For men fashion Numenor, men, those heroes of old that they sing of their women we hear less, save that they wept when their men were slain. Numenor was to be a rest after war, but if they weary of rest and the plays of peace, soon they will go back to their great play, manslaying and war. The final two lines stand out. Earlier in her monologue, Erendis was talking about how the men of Numenor were living their lives like children playing with new toys, because they had the peace, freedom, and longevity to do so. But here she says that if the men of Numenor grow bored of that, then they will go back to the ways of the Edain, their ancient heroes of war and killing. Although, to be fair, it's not like the Edain had a choice. Despite her bitterness and her clear hatred of men, Erendis has a point here. In the early days of Numenor, it seemed like a large place, and there wasn't much care for anything else beyond its shores. But when Aldarion founded the Guild of Venturers, it's only 750 years into the Second Age. Only a few generations in, and some of the Numenorians are growing bored with their island, and are sailing out on long voyages to explore Middle-earth. To be fair, at this time, the Guild of Venturers are a small minority, and they're not exploring with any malice in their hearts. But it's the first step. Basically, from the perspective of Erendis, the men of Numenor's insatiable desire to be everything, and their lack of caring for the simpler things in life, such as the love of their families, will eventually lead them down the path of seeking glory and power through war. Let's move on to Tar-Meneldur. Like Erendis, Tar-Meneldur didn't really approve of his son's constant voyages to Middle-earth. Even at Aldarion's first voyage with his grandfather, Veantia, Tar-Meneldur had an uneasy feeling, and it's said that his heart knew more than his mind did at this point. Later, he disapproves of Aldarion's voyages because he doesn't really believe that Aldarion is taking the important stuff seriously. He's the king's heir and he's meant to be looking for a wife, but he's rarely in Numenor. He then disapproves of Aldarion's treatment of Erendis. As you might expect, a rift forms between father and son. But in 883, Tar-Meneldur receives a letter from none other than Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor. Firstly, Gil-galad says that he's thankful for Tar-Meneldur sending Aldarion as an advisor, which he didn't. Gil-galad then explains the rising of a new shadow in the east, later revealed to be Sauron, and that he and Aldarion have already went over plans in case a war erupts. He asks Tar-Meneldur to reaffirm the ancient alliance between the elves and the Edain, and to support his son with men and materials so that he can properly fortify the haven of Vignalonde in Enedwaith, so that if a war does occur, then Numenor has a base of operations. On a personal level, this is a surprise to Tar-Meneldur. He didn't know about the business side of Aldarion's journeys, believing them all to be for his own leisure. The letter also causes Tar-Meneldur to have something of an existential crisis. He starts by saying that they were given Numenor to be a peaceful people and to put away war, which was meant to be ended because Morgoth was gone. But with war on the horizon, then what was Numenor to do? The following quote, I think, is a very profound statement. What can only be described as the dilemma between war and peace. I am in too great doubt to rule, to prepare or to let be, to prepare for war which is yet only guessed, train craftsmen and tillers in the midst of peace for blood spilling and battle, put iron in the hands of greedy captains who will love only conquest and count the slain as their glory. Will they say to Eru, at least your enemies were amongst them? Or to fold hands while friends die unjustly, let men live in blind peace until the ravisher is at the gate? What then will they do, match naked hands against iron and die in vain? Or flee, leaving the cries of women behind them? Will they say to Eru, at least I spilled no blood? Ultimately, Tar-Meneldur chooses to resign, believing that he has neither the will nor the expertise to make such a decision. However, he resigns knowing exactly what decision Aldarion will make, that he will continue to pursue relations with Gil-galad, and that Numenor will be further tied to Middle-earth. In the end, Aldarion's policies wouldn't have such an immediate impact. While he did continue to meet with the elves, Vignalonde was never finished, and the guild adventurers remained small, and when Calame became queen, she neglected her father's policies. That said, the ball had started rolling. Despite Tar and Calame dragging her feet, more and more Numenorians looked eastward, and by 1200 the Numenorians were constructing more permanent havens in Middle-earth. This meant that when the War of the Elves and Sauron erupted around 500 years later, the Numenorians were able to provide assistance and played a huge role in defeating Sauron's armies. And that was when the shift occurred. Going back to Tar-Meneldur's lament, iron had been put in the hands of greedy captains who loved only conquest and counted the slain as their glory. After Tar-Minestir, the captain who had led Numenor's forces during the War of the Elves and Sauron, the kings of Numenor started becoming greedy tyrants, slaying and subjugating the men of Middle-earth. In the end, Erendis and Tar-Meneldur predicted the same thing, but just through different ways. Erendis predicted that when the men of Numenor became bored, no longer enamored with the peace of their small island, they would start playing at war. And Tar-Meneldur predicted that when the Numenorians got a taste for war, they would not be rid of it. They were both right in the end. The ever-insatiable men of Numenor wanted more and more from the world, and when swords were put in their hands, they started taking things by force. Within a generation, the whole outlook of Numenor had changed. Tar-Minestir was a good king. His son, Tar-Kiriatan, was the first in a long line of oppressors. These two weren't the only ones to sense that Numenor's meddling in Middle-earth would only lead to pain and sorrow further down the road. Although it's not mentioned in the tale of Aldarion and Erendis, we are told that the Druidine who lived in Numenor, and firstly, yes, Druidine, the primitive men who aided the Rohirrim, yes, they did live in Numenor. Anyway, we are told that when Aldarion started making his voyages back to Middle-earth, the Druidine, who often had the gift of foresight, became uneasy and started to return to Middle-earth permanently. By the downfall of Numenor, none of them remained on the island. They too had seen Numenor's future thousands of years before it happened, and decided that it was too dark, and that it was time to leave. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. Honestly, I've been wanting to make a video about Tar-Meneldur's existential crisis for ages, but I just didn't know how to frame it or how to put it into a video that anyone would care about. I sort of wrote this script in a moment of inspiration, and I'm really glad that more people will now get exposed to that interesting part of Tolkien's lore. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you ever have an existential crisis, just do what Tar-Meneldur did, and resign and put all of your responsibilities on your child.